Winter morning, Brandywine Valley, Delaware. Fog rises from the river. Two estates stand less than 5 miles apart, both bearing the same family name. Nemours, a French chateau behind a 10-foot wall topped with broken glass, 3,200 running feet of it. Winterthur, 175 rooms climbing 9 stories into a hillside, 90,000 objects arranged in period rooms salvaged from demolished American homes. The silence of formal gardens in winter, the weight of locked gates, the strange repetition. 2 mansions, 2 cousins, 2 versions of the same wounded pride. These estates were not built for joy. They were built by men who could not find peace inside their own family. When a fortune is made from war, what kind of home does it build? If you enjoy deep investigations into America's great estates and the dynasties who built them, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which family to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. The story begins not in Delaware but in France, and not with gunpowder, but with politics. Pierre Samuel DuPont was born in 1739 into minor nobility, a man of ideas rather than land. He became an economist, a writer, a participant in the intellectual ferment that preceded the Revolution. He served in the Estates General, the assembly that would soon tear France apart. The title de Nemours came from the French king himself, a reference to the town near Paris, a mark of modest distinction in an era when such marks still carried weight. When the Revolution turned violent, when the guillotine became the instrument of policy, Pierre Samuel found himself on the wrong side of shifting allegiances. He had survived the terror once. He did not intend to test his luck again. In January of 1800, he gathered 14 family members and fled. They crossed the Atlantic not as conquerors, but as refugees, carrying with them education, ambition, and very little else. America was young. America was hungry. America, they hoped, would be safer than what they had left behind. Among those 14 was Pierre Samuel's son, Eleuthère-René DuPont. He was 28 years old when he arrived, trained as a chemist under Antoine-Laurent Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry. Lavoisier had taught him precision, measurement, the science of transformation. Lavoisier had also been executed by the Revolution. His genius no protection against the blade. Eleuthère-René carried that lesson with him. Knowledge alone was not enough. Knowledge had to be applied. Knowledge had to make money. The question was how. The DuPonts tried various ventures in their first years in America. A land speculation scheme collapsed. A trading company struggled. The family needed something more reliable, something with demand that would not fade. Eleuthère-René found his answer on a hunting trip. The gunpowder, available in America, was inferior, inconsistent in quality, unreliable in performance. He had trained under Lavoisier. He understood the chemistry. He could make better powder. In 1802, Eleuthère-René purchased 95 acres on the Brandywine River near Wilmington, Delaware. The price was $6,740. The land had belonged to Jacob Broom, whose cotton mill had failed. The site offered everything a powder mill required: water flow to power the grinding wheels, willow trees for charcoal, and proximity to the Delaware River for shipments of sulfur and saltpeter, the other essential ingredients. The failed enterprise of one man became the foundation for another's empire. The product itself was deceptively simple. Gunpowder consists of 3 components: potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur, mixed in precise proportions, ground to specific fineness, pressed and dried and granulated. The chemistry was understood. The danger was constant. Powder mills exploded. Workers died. The margin between a successful batch and a catastrophe was measured in moisture content, in grinding pressure, in the carelessness of a single moment. Eleuthère-René built his mills with walls designed to direct blast force over the river, away from other buildings. He understood that explosions were not possibilities, but certainties. The question was only when, and how many would die. The business grew slowly at first. Contracts came from merchants, from hunters, from the small needs of a young nation. The DuPonts reinvested profits, expanded capacity, improved processes. They built worker housing along the Brandywine, communities with names like Upper Banks, Charles Banks, Duck Street, Chicken Alley, Walker's Bank. Irish immigrants filled the labor force, men willing to work dangerous jobs for steady pay. The DuPonts provided housing, provisions, a kind of paternalistic order. The workers provided their labor, and, when the mills exploded, their lives. The acceleration came with war. The War of 1812 brought government contracts, and suddenly the small mill on the Brandywine was producing powder for the nation's defense. Total sales during the conflict exceeded 500,000 pounds. The pattern was established. American conflict meant DuPont profit. The family had found their formula, one that would hold for more than a century: sulfur, charcoal, saltpeter, and war. Eleuthère-Irénée DuPont died in 1834, but the company he founded did not die with him. His sons continued the work. The mills expanded. The techniques improved. The explosions continued, and so did the profits. The DuPont had planted their roots in Delaware soil. The next century would water those roots with government contracts and blood. The DuPont fortune did not accumulate gradually. It arrived in surges, each surge corresponding to American bloodshed. The pattern established during the War of 1812 would repeat with remarkable consistency across the next century. When the nation fought, the DuPonts prospered. The relationship was not incidental, it was structural. The Civil War transformed the family from successful manufacturers into essential suppliers of national defense. Between 1861 and 1865, DuPont powder mills produced nearly one-third of all gunpowder used by Union forces. 4 million barrels flowed from the Brandywine to federal arsenals, to battlefields at Antietam and Gettysburg and Cold Harbor. Each barrel represented profit. Each barrel also represented capacity to kill. The DuPonts did not fire the weapons, but they filled them. By the war's end, the family fortune had consolidated into something approaching permanence. They were no longer immigrants struggling to establish themselves. They were industrialists whose product had helped preserve the Union. The decades after the Civil War brought continued growth. The company expanded beyond the Brandywine, acquiring competitors, building new facilities, refining production methods. By the turn of the century, DuPont controlled a significant share of the American explosives market. Dynamite joined gunpowder in the product line. Mining operations across the country depended on DuPont blasting materials. The military remained a steady customer, but nothing in the company's history prepared it for what came next. In 1914, war erupted in Europe. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo triggered a cascade of alliances and mobilizations that soon engulfed the continent. France and Britain found themselves locked in trench warfare against Germany, consuming ammunition at rates that dwarfed all previous conflicts. The artillery barrages alone required quantities of explosive that European manufacturers could not supply. The Allies needed powder. They needed it immediately. They needed it in quantities that seemed almost impossible. DuPont had the capacity. DuPont had the expertise. DuPont had the willingness. The company's revenue in 1914 stood at $25 million, already substantial by the standards of the era. By 1918, that figure had climbed to $319 million. Over the 5 years of the war, total revenue reached $1.245 billion. Annual profits averaged $59 million throughout the conflict. The family fortune, estimated at $74 million before the war, swelled to $329 million by its conclusion. These were not incremental gains. This was transformation. The scale of production matched the scale of profit. DuPont supplied 40% of all explosives used by Allied forces during the First World War. the company manufactured 1.5 billion pounds of munitions, a quantity almost beyond comprehension. To meet demand, DuPont constructed new facilities at unprecedented speed. Near Nashville, Tennessee, the company built what became the largest smokeless powder factory in the world. At its peak, the munitions division employed 37,000 workers. Production that had once been measured in thousands of pounds per year was now measured in millions of pounds per day. The wealth was real. The cost was also real, and it was paid on the Brandywine. Between 1802 and 1921, company records documented 288 explosions at DuPont facilities. These were not minor incidents. These were catastrophic failures that killed 228 workers, men, women, and children. The dead included laborers who packed powder into barrels, foremen who supervised grinding operations, family members who lived in company housing adjacent to the mills. Some explosions claimed single victims, others killed dozens in seconds. The pattern began early. In 1815, 8 workmen died when a pounding mill detonated. In 1818, 36 workers perished in a single blast, an incident attributed to a foreman's drinking. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont's own wife, Sophie, was injured in that explosion. The company responded with a policy that would endure for generations: free housing and lifetime pensions for widows and dependents of workers killed in mill accidents. The policy acknowledged the inevitability of death. It did not prevent it. In 1857, 5 employees died in an explosion that also killed Alexis Irénée DuPont, a company partner and family member. The Brandywine did not distinguish between workers and owners when powder ignited. In 1863, 13 men died in a packing room explosion that destroyed 10,000 pounds of powder. Later that same year, additional blasts killed 40 more. The Civil War demanded production. Production demanded risk. Risk produced corpses. The 1890s brought no respite. On October 7, 1890, 12 workers died in 8 seconds when over 100 tons of powder ignited simultaneously. 7 buildings were destroyed. The blast crater permanently altered the landscape along the river. Survivors described a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, followed by silence, followed by screaming. The worst single incident came during the war that made the family's greatest fortune. On November 30, 1915, 30 workers died in a pellet packing house explosion. Many of the dead were young, recent hires brought on to meet wartime production quotas. They had been on the job for weeks or months. They died in an instant, transformed from workers into statistics in a ledger that already held too many names. The workers who filled DuPont payrolls came from the communities that clustered along the Brandywine: Upper Banks, Charles Banks, Duck Street, Chicken Alley, Walker's Bank, Henry Clay Village. Irish immigrants had formed the original workforce, men willing to accept dangerous employment in exchange for steady wages and company housing. Their descendants remained generation after generation, living within earshot of the mills, knowing that any workday might end in fire. By the early 20th century, the DuPont ranked among the wealthiest families in America. The powder mills had made them rich beyond the dreams of the refugees who had fled France a century earlier. The powder mills had also killed 228 people whose names appear in company records but rarely in family histories. The DuPonts were not murderers. No court would ever use that word. But the fortune that built Nemours and Winterthur, that funded gardens and antique collections and children's hospitals, began with explosions on the Brandywine. The money was clean by the time it purchased chandeliers. The blood had long since washed downstream. Alfred Irénée DuPont was born into the dynasty in 1864, 2 years before the Civil War ended, heir to a fortune built on powder and blood. He grew up in the Brandywine Valley surrounded by cousins, aunts, uncles, and the constant presence of the family business. The mills hummed, the money accumulated, The DuPonts multiplied across the Delaware landscape, building homes within sight of one another, intermarrying with careful attention to bloodlines and assets, creating a network so dense that family and company became nearly indistinguishable. Alfred did not fit easily into this world. He was an inventor, a tinkerer, a man who preferred machines to social gatherings. Over his lifetime, he would hold more than 200 patents, evidence of a restless technical mind that found satisfaction in solving mechanical problems. He kept a windowless office in the basement, a retreat from the obligations of wealth and the expectations of his name. While cousins pursued business expansion and social prominence, Alfred disappeared into his workshop. The family noticed. The family always noticed. His first marriage seemed conventional enough. Bessie Gardner came from acceptable stock, and Alfred wed her in the manner expected of DuPont men. They had children. They occupied the appropriate social position. From the outside, the union appeared stable. From the inside, something had already begun to fracture. The rupture came in 1906. Alfred divorced Bessie, an act that carried significant scandal in an era when divorce remained relatively rare among the upper classes. But the divorce itself was not the wound that would never heal. Alfred evicted Bessie from their home with approximately 1 week's notice. Then he razed the ancestral property known as Swamp Hall to the ground, demolishing the structure as if erasing the marriage from physical existence. The act was not merely legal separation, it was obliteration. The family responded. Pierre S. DuPont, Alfred's cousin and business rival, joined with other relatives to build Bessie and her children a new home. The gesture was generous. It was also a statement. The DuPonts had chosen sides, and they had not chosen Alfred. The divorce might have been forgiven. The cruelty could not. The situation grew worse. Alicia Hayward Bradford was a married woman when Alfred's attention fixed upon her. She was married specifically to George Amory Maddox, who happened to be Alfred's own secretary. The arrangement that followed became the subject of family gossip for generations. Alfred reportedly paid Maddox $1 million to divorce Alicia and relocate permanently to Europe. The sum was extraordinary, the equivalent of tens of millions in contemporary currency, a price paid not for property or patents, but for a man's willingness to disappear. 2 weeks after Alicia's divorce was finalized, she married Alfred. The speed was unseemly. The circumstances were worse. Whispers circulated through DuPont gatherings about Alicia's daughter, born during her marriage to Maddox, but suspected by many to be Alfred's biological child. The timeline invited speculation. The family speculated freely and not quietly. Alfred's response was litigation. He filed slander lawsuits against multiple family members, attempting to silence the gossip through legal force. The suits went nowhere. All were eventually dropped, leaving Alfred with legal bills, public embarrassment, and cousins who now had formal grievances to add to their informal contempt. The lawsuits did not restore his reputation. They confirmed his isolation. Behind this public scandal lay an older, quieter tragedy. Alfred's younger brother Louis had been in love with Bessie Gardner before Alfred married her. The precise sequence of events remains unclear in surviving records, but the outcome does not. When Alfred wed Bessie, Louis committed suicide. The family never forgot. How could they? Every time they looked at Alfred, they saw the brother who had lived and the brother who had died. The marriage that occasioned Louis's death had now ended in divorce and demolition. The entire sequence seemed cursed. The DuPont family was vast, interconnected, and capable of coordinated response. After Alfred's marriage to Alicia, the response was exclusion. Social invitations ceased. The gatherings that marked DuPont life, the dinners and holidays and celebrations that kept the clan cohesive, no longer included Alfred and his new wife. Business relationships strained. Conversations ended when Alfred entered rooms. He remained a DuPont by blood and a shareholder by inheritance, but he was no longer a DuPont in any meaningful social sense. The ostracism was comprehensive. In Wilmington, in the Brandywine Valley, the DuPont name opened every door. For Alfred, those doors now closed. His cousins controlled the company, the social calendar, the charitable boards, the political connections. They did not need him. They did not want him. They made their feelings clear through the most devastating weapon available to the wealthy: silence. Alfred found himself in a position almost unique in American life. He possessed wealth beyond ordinary comprehension, a fortune sufficient to purchase virtually anything material. He could not purchase acceptance. He could not purchase forgiveness. He could not undo his brother's suicide, or unsay the words that had prompted lawsuits, or rebuild the house he had demolished, or restore the marriage he had ended with such brutal efficiency. The money that could solve most problems could not solve this one. The newspapers of the era covered the situation with varying degrees of discretion. One headline captured the dynamic with memorable economy: the War of the DuPont Women. The phrase reduced complex human relationships to melodrama, but it contained a truth. The women of the family, the wives and mothers and daughters who maintained social connections and enforced social norms, had rendered their verdict. Alfred was out. A man with perhaps $200 million stood alone in the Delaware landscape, surrounded by relatives who would not speak to him. He had a new wife whom the family refused to receive. He had patents and inventions and technical brilliance, and absolutely no community willing to acknowledge his existence. The powder mills still produced their profits. The dividends still arrived. The fortune still grew. None of it mattered in the ways that mattered most. Alfred decided to build, not a modest home suitable for a couple in social exile, not a practical residence scaled to actual need. He would build a palace, a monument, a physical declaration of worth that required no family approval. If the DuPonts would not receive him, he would create a world that did not need their reception. He would build for Alicia, the wife for whom he had paid $1 million, the woman the family blamed for his disgrace. He would build walls high enough to keep out everyone, especially those of his own name. He would build not for comfort, but for proof. Alfred DuPont did not choose modest architects for his Declaration of Independence. He selected Carrere and Hastings, the firm responsible for the New York Public Library, the Frick Mansion on Fifth Avenue, and Henry Flagler's Whitehall in Palm Beach. These were men who understood scale, who knew how to translate wealth into stone, who could design buildings meant to intimidate as much as shelter. They had built for robber barons and industrialists. They would now build for a DuPont in exile. The commission called for a French chateau in the Louis XVI style, executed in the Beaux-Arts tradition that Carrere and Hastings had mastered. The model was explicit: the Petit Trianon at Versailles, Marie Antoinette's private retreat from the formal court, a building designed for escape. The symbolism was not accidental. Alfred wanted a refuge, and he wanted that refuge to reference royalty. If his family treated him as an outcast, he would live like a king. The estate would be called Nemours, after the title his ancestors had carried from France, a name that connected Alfred to aristocratic origins older than any American fortune. Smith and Sons of Wilmington received the construction contract. Local labor would build the house, though the design came from New York and the inspiration from Versailles. Ground was broken in 1909. The primary structure rose in approximately 12 months, a pace that reflected both DuPont resources and DuPont impatience. Alfred wanted his palace completed. He wanted to move in with Alicia. He wanted physical proof that ostracism had not diminished him. The property encompassed 300 acres, a substantial holding even by DuPont standards. The mansion itself covered 47,000 square feet across 5 stories. The room count varied depending on how one defined a room. Sources cite between 77 and 105 distinct spaces. The construction cost, translated into contemporary currency, approached $54 million. This was not a house. This was a statement, written in limestone and slate, and imported French furnishings. The interiors matched the exterior ambition. Alfred and Alicia filled the rooms with French antiques from the 17th and 18th centuries, pieces acquired from European estates and dealers who understood that American industrial money could purchase what European aristocratic decline could no longer maintain. The dining room chandelier reportedly came from Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, Habsburg crystal, now illuminating DuPont meals. The provenance connected Alfred to imperial tradition, to a world of courts and titles that predated the powder mills by centuries. The clock collection revealed Alfred's particular sensibility. Among the timepieces was a Louis XVI musical clock crafted by David Röntgen and Peter Kinzing around 1785, a mechanical marvel originally made for Marie Antoinette herself. The queen who had retreated to the Petit Trianon, the queen who had lost her head to revolution, now contributed a possession to the American exile who had modeled his home on her refuge. The historical echoes were layered and perhaps intentional. Alfred understood irony. He understood that wealth could purchase objects, but not the contexts that had created them. The basement offered different pleasures. A bowling alley provided recreation without requiring social engagement. A garage housed Alfred's collection of vintage automobiles, mechanical objects he could appreciate without the complications of human relationship. The house accommodated both formal grandeur and private retreat, spaces for entertaining guests who never came, and spaces for solitary pursuits that required no audience. The conservatory had been filled with bird cages since 1910, the year the house was completed. The image carries symbolic weight, beautiful creatures contained behind bars, singing in a glass room attached to a mansion surrounded by walls. Whether Alfred intended the metaphor is unknown. The birds remained regardless, generation after generation, their songs echoing through a space designed for tropical plants and filtered light. The full inventory of Nemours would not be completed until nearly a century later, when conservators cataloged the contents for renovation. The count reached 110,000 individual items: furniture, artwork, decorative objects, books, clocks, china, silver, textiles. Each piece had been selected, purchased, transported, and placed. The accumulation represented not merely wealth, but attention, the focused effort of filling a house that might otherwise have felt empty. The gardens extended the architectural vision into landscape. Alfred commissioned the largest formal French-style jardin à la Française in North America, a geometric composition of parterre, allée, and focal points that stretched 1/3 of a mile from the mansion facade. The main vista drew the eye along a central axis, past clipped boxwood and stone balustrades, toward a reflecting pool that covered a full acre and held 800,000 gallons of water. 157 jets could launch that water 12 feet into the air, a display of hydraulic engineering in service of aesthetic effect. Additional features accumulated over the years. A colonnade memorial appeared in 1926. A temple of love provided classical punctuation. Boxwood parterre gardens offered formal structure. A carillon tower eventually rose, its bells capable of sounding across the property. The gardens were never truly finished. They evolved as Alfred's resources and interests directed, each addition extending the original vision without completing it. And then there was the wall, 10 feet high, 3,200 running feet in total length. Constructed of Brandywine granite, the same stone that underlay the powder, mills, and the family fortune. The wall enclosed the estate completely, separating Nemours from the surrounding landscape, from the roads, from the neighbors, from the world. This alone would have been remarkable, a perimeter barrier of unusual scale for a private residence. but Alfred added a detail that transformed the wall from boundary into weapon. Along its top, embedded in mortar, ran a continuous line of broken glass shards. The jagged edges pointed upward, designed to cut anyone who attempted to climb over. The wall was not merely a marker of property. It was a threat. When asked about this feature, Alfred reportedly offered an explanation that the family would never forget. The glass was meant to keep out intruders, mainly those of the name DuPont. The statement was joke and wound simultaneously. Alfred had built his palace. He had surrounded it with beauty and mechanical ingenuity and objects fit for queens, and he had topped the perimeter with broken bottles, a barrier as crude as it was effective, aimed specifically at his own relatives. The estate was complete. The message was clear. Alfred had created a world that did not require family approval, a world protected by walls that would draw blood from anyone who tried to enter uninvited. He had built for Alicia, the wife the family would not receive. He had built against the cousins who had cast him out. The question remained whether the wall was meant to keep people out or to keep something in. Perhaps Alfred himself did not know. Perhaps the glass pointed in both directions. The wedding of Alfred the Firm DuPont and Alicia Hayward Bradford took place in 1907, a union that had already cost $1 million in payments to her former husband and immeasurable damage to Alfred's standing within his own family. The ceremony itself should have marked a beginning, a fresh start for two people who had sacrificed considerably to be together. Instead, the day carried an omen that neither bride nor groom could have anticipated. On the same day that Alfred and Alicia exchanged vows, a DuPont plant in Fontenay, Indiana, exploded. 27 workers died in the blast. The honeymoon was postponed. The couple who had disrupted so many lives to pursue their union found their celebration interrupted by the deaths of men whose labor sustained the fortune that made the wedding possible. Whether Alfred saw meaning in the coincidence is not recorded. The timing was noted. The timing would be remembered. The marriage that followed was shadowed from its first hours. Alfred had built Nemours as a gift for Alicia, a palace to compensate for the family that would not receive her, the social world that had closed its doors. The house rose, the gardens took shape. The wall went up with its crown of broken glass. Everything that money could provide was provided. What money could not provide proved more elusive. 4 children were born to Alfred and Alicia during their marriage. None survived. Infancy. The records do not specify causes of death. Medical understanding in the early 20th century remained limited, and infant mortality, while declining, still claimed children across all social classes. Wealth offered better doctors, better care, better odds. It did not offer guarantees. 4 times Alicia carried a pregnancy. 4 times the nursery at Nemours received preparations. 4 times those preparations proved futile. The nursery remained, a room furnished for children who would never occupy it. The cumulative weight of these losses pressed upon a marriage already strained by external circumstances. Alfred and Alicia had chosen each other against family opposition, had endured scandal and ostracism, had retreated behind walls both literal and social. They had each other, and they had Nemours, and for a time perhaps that seemed sufficient. But isolation compounds grief. There were no cousins to visit, no family gatherings to attend, no wider community to absorb and distribute the pain of loss. There was only the 2 of them in a 47,000-square-foot house, surrounded by French antiques and bird cages and gardens that stretched toward a reflecting pool, alone with their sorrow. Alicia began spending extensive time in France. The country that had given the DuPonts their name, the country from which Pierre Samuel had fled more than a century earlier, became her refuge from the refuge Alfred had built. The reasons for her absences are not fully documented in surviving records. Perhaps she sought distance from a house filled with memories of children who had not lived. Perhaps she sought distance from a husband whose intensity had drawn her in, and now felt suffocating. Perhaps she simply needed to be somewhere that was not Nemours, somewhere without walls topped with glass, somewhere that did not represent both gift and prison simultaneously. The marriage did not recover. The combination proved too heavy. The scandal that had preceded, their union, the family rejection that had followed, the 4 infant deaths that punctuated their years together, the isolation that Alfred had chosen, and Alicia had accepted but perhaps never wanted. Nemours had been built as proof of love, as compensation for exclusion, as a world complete unto itself. It became instead a monument to disappointment, a beautiful container for grief that no amount of French furniture or hydraulic fountains could dispel. In 1920, Alicia died. The death was sudden. The cause is recorded variously in different sources, but the impact was unambiguous. Alfred, who had paid $1 million to marry her, who had raised his ancestral home and endured his family's contempt and built a palace behind walls specifically designed to wound his own relatives, found himself alone. The woman for whom Nemours existed was gone. Alfred's response survives in his own words. He wrote that this beautiful home built for her by him was of no use to anyone. Fouquem sentence contains everything. The acknowledgement that the house had been built for Alicia specifically, the recognition that without her it lost its purpose, the despair of a man surrounded by 110,000 objects and no one to share them with. The reflecting pool still held its 800,000 gallons. The 157 jets still functioned. The clocks that had belonged to Marie Antoinette still kept time. None of it mattered. Alfred did not remain alone for long. In 1921, 1 year after Alicia's death, he married Jessie Ball, a woman from Virginia whom he had known since childhood. Jessie was practical, capable, and willing to share life behind the glass-topped walls. She would become the principal trustee of Alfred's estate with complete discretion over its management and disposition. The marriage to Jessie was, by most accounts, more stable than the marriage to Alicia. It was also not the marriage for which Nemours had been built. The man who had constructed walls to keep out his family now lived alone behind them, or nearly alone. The house was not complete. The gardens were not yet finished. Alfred would spend the next 15 years adding, refining, perfecting a place that was supposed to make him happy but never did. The lower gardens would not be completed until the early 1930s. The Carillon Tower came later still. Each addition extended the original vision without fulfilling it. Nemours grew more beautiful and more empty simultaneously. The nursery remained. 5 miles from Nemours, on the same rolling Delaware landscape, another DuPont was growing up with a different set of wounds. Henry Francis DuPont was born in 1880 at Winterthur, the family estate his grandfather had established decades earlier. He arrived as the only surviving son among 7 children, a position that carried both privilege and unbearable expectation. His father, Henry Algernon DuPont, was not a man who accepted weakness or tolerated failure. Henry Algernon had graduated as valedictorian from West Point. He had served with distinction in the Civil War. He would later become a United States Senator from Delaware. He embodied the DuPont virtues as he understood them: discipline, achievement, command. He expected his son to follow a similar path, to demonstrate the qualities that military training and family heritage should have instilled. He expected wrong. Henry Francis was shy. He was lonely. He was, by his own admission, not intelligent in the ways that mattered to his father. He would later write that he knew he was stupid, a self-assessment that reflected less actual cognitive limitation than the internalized judgment of a parent who could not hide his disappointment. At Groton, the elite preparatory school that shaped young men for Harvard and Yale and lives of leadership, Henry Francis placed last in his class of 16. The ranking was not a statistical anomaly. It was confirmation of what his father already believed. The cousins noticed. They always noticed. In a family as interconnected as the DuPonts, where children grew up in proximity and comparison was inevitable, Henry Francis stood out for the wrong reasons. His interests ran to domestic matters, flowers, arrangements, the visual details of household management. The cousins called him milkmaid, a label that carried obvious implications about masculinity and worth. The mockery stung. The mockery persisted. His mother's death in 1902 deepened both his grief and his obligations. Henry Algernon, the senator and soldier, had no patience for managing a household. He immediately summoned Henry Francis back from whatever pursuits had occupied him and installed him as de facto domestic manager of Winterthur. The son who could not succeed in academics or athletics or business would at least make himself useful in the sphere his cousins dismissed as feminine. Henry Francis was 22 years old. He would spend the next quarter-century under his father's roof and his father's shadow. The property itself carried history older than Henry Francis's disappointments. The name Winterthur referenced not Delaware, but Switzerland, the ancestral home of Jacques-Antoine Biedermann, who had married Evelina Gabrielle DuPont in the 1830s. Biedermann built the original structure between 1839 and 1842, a 12-room Greek Revival manor suitable for a prosperous family in antebellum America. The house passed through generations, modified and expanded as tastes and resources allowed. By 1889, Henry Algernon had converted the building into a French-style manor, erasing the Greek Revival origins in favor of something more fashionable. By 1902, further expansion brought the room count to 30. The estate grew around the house, farms, outbuildings, cottages for workers, barns for livestock. When Henry Algernon died in 1926, and Henry Francis finally inherited, Winterthur comprised 90 buildings spread across more than 2,600 acres. The inheritance also included approximately $50 million in cash and securities. Henry Francis was 46 years old. He had waited his entire adult life for this moment. The money and property arrived, but something had already changed. 3 years earlier, in 1923, Henry Francis had visited the Vermont home of Electra Havemeyer Webb, a collector whose approach to American antiques would reshape his understanding of what was possible. Webb displayed her acquisitions not as isolated objects in museum cases, but as components of complete rooms, period settings that recreated the environments in which 18th and 19th century Americans had actually lived. The furniture stood on appropriate floors, beneath appropriate ceilings, beside appropriate windows. Context gave meaning. Arrangement created atmosphere. Henry Francis saw the rooms, and something shifted. He had spent decades failing to meet expectations, his father's expectations, his cousin's expectations, the expectations that accompanied the DuPont name. He could not compete in business, where cousins like Pierre controlled the company and made the decisions that shaped the family fortune. He could not match his father's military distinction or political achievement. He could not overcome the verdict that Groton had rendered, and his own self-assessment had confirmed. But this arrangement of objects into meaningful wholes, this creation of beauty through selection and placement, this he could do. This he could do better than anyone. His first significant purchase came the same year, a Pennsylvania chest dated 1737, a piece of American craftsmanship nearly 2 centuries old. The chest was a beginning, not an end. Over the following decades, Henry Francis would acquire approximately 90,000 objects made or used in America between 1640 and 1860. He would purchase not merely furniture, but entire rooms, architectural elements salvaged from demolished houses across the eastern seaboard, paneling from colonial homes, mantels from Federal-era mansions, floorboards and doorframes and ceiling medallions. He bought the pieces of other people's houses and installed them in his own. The logic was compensation. Henry Francis could not be what his father had wanted. He could not be what his cousins expected. He could not overcome the childhood that had labeled him stupid and milkmaid and last in his class. But he could build something that none of them could match, a collection so comprehensive and so carefully assembled that it would stand as the definitive repository of American decorative arts. The house would become the collection. The collection would become his identity. The shy boy who had disappointed everyone would become the man who created Winterthur. While Alfred built walls topped with broken glass to keep his family out, Henry Francis began a different project. He dismantled other people's houses to bring them in. He acquired the physical remains of American domestic history and incorporated them into a structure that grew to accommodate his obsession. Each room became a period setting. Each setting required appropriate objects. Each acquisition justified another. The collection expanded because the collection could always expand. There was always another chest, another chair, another paneled wall waiting to be rescued from demolition and installed at Winterthur. The cousins who had called him milkmaid would eventually tour his creation. The father who had found him disappointing would not live to see the transformation. Henry Francis had found his purpose. It looked nothing like what anyone had expected. It would outlast them all. The inheritance arrived in 1926, and Henry Francis DuPont immediately began to build. The 30-room manor he had managed under his father's supervision was insufficient for what he now envisioned. The collection demanded space. The collection would receive it. Between 1929 and 1931, Winterthur underwent an expansion that transformed it from a large country house into something approaching institutional scale. The project added a wing 150 feet long, effectively doubling the size of the residence. The cost reached $4.3 million, a substantial sum even for a DuPont, equivalent to tens of millions in contemporary currency. More than 100 stonecutters and masons found employment on the site, shaping material quarried from the estate's own property. The stone that underlay Winterthur's acres rose to form its walls. The land contributed directly to its own transformation. The work did not stop when the wing was complete. Additional expansions continued from 1931 through 1951, a 20-year campaign of construction that reshaped the building repeatedly. Each phase added rooms. Each phase added capacity for objects. By the time Henry Francis considered the project finished, Winterthur had grown to 175 rooms distributed across 9 stories above the hill base. The total area reached 96,582 square feet, making it the 5th largest historic house in the United States. Only a handful of American residences exceeded its dimensions, and none matched its specific purpose. The rooms were not empty spaces awaiting furniture. They were period settings, each designed to recreate a specific moment in American domestic history. The span covered 1640 to 1860, more than 2 centuries of chairs and tables and textiles and silver, of changing tastes and evolving craftsmanship. Henry Francis did not simply collect objects. He collected contexts. He purchased architectural elements from demolished buildings across the eastern seaboard and installed them at Winterthur, creating rooms whose walls and floors and ceilings had originated elsewhere. The sources read like a catalog of vanished American houses. Paneling came from Graham House, from Belle Isle, from Mortington, from the James Watson House. Wood that had witnessed colonial life, that had absorbed the smoke of 18th-century hearths and the voices of 19th-century families, was carefully removed, transported to Delaware, and reassembled within Winterthur's expanding shell. The process required expertise and patience. Original elements had to be measured, documented, dismantled without damage, shipped without loss, and reinstalled with precision sufficient to recreate their original appearance. Each room represented months or years of effort. Each room added to a whole that seemed to have no natural limit. The collection these rooms contained eventually numbered approximately 90,000 objects. The count is almost impossible to comprehend as individual items. 90,000 pieces of furniture, ceramics, silver, textiles, paintings, prints, and decorative objects, each selected by Henry Francis or acquired under his direction, each assigned a place within the period room structure he had created. The accumulation represented not merely wealth, but obsession, the focused attention of a man who had found his purpose and pursued it without restraint. The library holdings extended the scope further. 87,000 rare books eventually lined the shelves, along with more than 800,000 manuscripts and images. The collection's origins reached back to the family's founding generation. Pierre Samuel DuPont had assembled approximately 8,000 books before his death in 1817, and that core had grown across generations. Henry Francis added to it systematically, acquiring materials that documented American material culture, that provided context for the objects in his rooms, that made Winterthur a research institution as well as a display. Specialized collections developed within the larger whole. The Campbell collection of soup tureens gathered European, Asian, and American pieces dating from 1720 to the present, an entire category of decorative art assembled with the same thoroughness Henry Francis applied to everything. Oriental and ingrain rugs covered the appropriate floors. Each edition refined the period settings, brought them closer to the historical accuracy Henry Francis sought. The house that resulted was peculiar in ways that visitors often noticed. 40 bedrooms offered accommodation, each equipped with a radio, a modern amenity that coexisted uneasily with 17th-century paneling. Henry Francis and his wife, Ruth, lived within the collection, sleeping in rooms furnished with museum-quality antiques, eating in dining rooms whose architectural elements had been salvaged from demolished mansions. The boundary between residence and repository blurred until it nearly disappeared. Maintaining this creation required labor on an extraordinary scale. At its peak, the estate employed 90 gardeners, a workforce one observer described as a private army. The total population reached 250 employees, housed in 99 cottages scattered across the property. The estate operated its own post office and its own railway station. Visitors arrived by private rail, descending onto DuPont property without passing through public space. The farm supplied the family table with milk, eggs, and guinea hens, a self-sufficiency that recalled earlier eras even as the house filled with objects from those eras. The Holstein cattle herd became nationally significant, dominating awards from the Holstein-Friesian Association through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. Henry Francis, who had identified his occupation as farmer on tax returns, pursued animal husbandry with the same attention he devoted to furniture acquisition. Excellence in one domain supported excellence in another. The estate functioned as a complete world. Contemporary observers reached for European analogies. Winterthur operated like a duchy, they said, or a private Ruritanian fiefdom. The comparisons were not entirely fanciful. Henry Francis presided over 2,600 acres, 250 employees, 90,000 objects, and a house larger than most museums. He made decisions without consultation. He set standards without appeal. The shy boy who had placed last in his class at Groton had become, within his own domain, something close to a sovereign. The distinction between house and museum had collapsed. Henry Francis DuPont did not live in a house. He lived in a museum that happened to contain bedrooms where he slept and dining rooms where he ate. The arrangement suited him. Whether it could continue after his death was a question he would eventually have to answer. The collection was too large, too important, too expensive for any individual to maintain indefinitely. Winterthur would have to find another purpose, or Winterthur would have to be sold. Neither option was acceptable. A third path would have to be found. The fortune that built Nemours and Winterthur carried a stain that no amount of French furniture or period rooms could entirely remove. The DuPonts had grown rich from war, and by the 1930s, the American public had begun to notice. The phrase emerged in newspapers and magazines, a label that would cling to the family for decades: merchants of death. The words reduced complex industrial history to simple moral judgment. The DuPonts had sold explosives to governments. Governments had used those explosives to kill millions. The DuPonts had profited enormously. The connection seemed clear, even if the ethics remained debatable. Other companies had also supplied munitions. Other families had also grown wealthy. But the DuPonts, with their vast Delaware estates and their visible consumption, became the symbol of war profiteering in the public imagination. The United States Senate decided to investigate. Between 1934 and 1936, the Munitions Investigating Committee, often called the Nye Committee, after its chairman, examined the role of American industry in promoting and profiting from warfare. The hearings drew national attention. Witnesses testified about contracts, prices, lobbying, and the relationships between manufacturers and military officials. The DuPonts appeared prominently among the subjects of inquiry. Lamotte DuPont testified. Pierre DuPont testified. Irénée DuPont testified. The three brothers represented the family's leadership during the World War and its aftermath, the men who had overseen the expansion from $25 million in annual revenue to $319 million, who had watched the family fortune grow from $74 million to $329 million in 5 years of European slaughter. They answered questions. They provided documents. They defended their conduct as legitimate business in response to legitimate demand. The committee found no criminal wrongdoing. The DuPont had not violated laws. They had manufactured products that governments purchased voluntarily, products those governments used for purposes the governments chose. The legal framework offered no basis for prosecution. But the committee's findings included details that damaged the family's reputation regardless of legal outcome. Among the revelations, evidence suggested that DuPont interests had worked to sabotage the League of Nations Disarmament Conference in Geneva. The company that profited from war had allegedly undermined efforts to prevent it. Public perception shifted. The DuPonts had been seen as industrialists, builders, employers, philanthropists. Now they were seen as something darker, a family whose wealth depended on death, whose interests aligned against peace. The label merchants of death proved difficult to shed. It appeared in editorials, in books, in the casual conversation of Americans who had never met a DuPont but knew what the name represented. The company responded with the tools available to corporations facing public relations challenges. Radio sponsorships associated the DuPont name with entertainment and goodwill rather than explosives and casualties. In 1939, the company introduced a slogan that would endure for decades: better things for better living through chemistry. The phrase signaled transformation. DuPont made nylon now and plastics and consumer products that improved daily life. The pivot from munitions to materials accelerated. The family wanted to be known for stockings, not shells. The political activities of the interwar period told a more complicated story. In 1934, the same year, the Senate began investigating war profits. Several DuPont joined with associates to found the American Liberty League. The founders included Irénée DuPont, Pierre DuPont, Lamotte DuPont, and John J. Roscoe, a DuPont executive who had also chaired the Democratic National Committee. The organization's purpose was explicit: defeat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, end the New Deal, oppose the expansion of federal power that the Depression had accelerated. The League positioned itself as a defender of constitutional principles and individual liberty. Its practical agenda was more specific. The DuPonts and their allies opposed Social Security. They opposed unemployment insurance. They opposed minimum wage legislation. They opposed the regulatory apparatus that the Roosevelt administration was constructing to manage an economy that had collapsed under the weight of unregulated speculation. The League represented wealth defending itself against democracy's response to wealth's failures. The funding reflected DuPont commitment. The family contributed approximately 30% of the League's total budget, which reached $1.2 million. Irene DuPont alone provided $79,750 in loans to the organization. When the 1936 election approached, 18 members of the DuPont family donated a combined $855,520 to Republican candidates and causes. The sum was extraordinary, a coordinated financial assault on the incumbent president and his policies. Roosevelt won anyway. He won overwhelmingly, carrying 46 of 48 states, a landslide that buried the Liberty League and its backers. The organization became a symbol of plutocratic overreach, wealthy men attempting to purchase political outcomes and failing spectacularly. Critics nicknamed it the Cellophane League, a DuPont product, because you could see right through it. The mockery captured something true. The DuPonts had spent lavishly and lost completely. Their money had purchased nothing but confirmation of their unpopularity. Yet the family's public activities included genuine philanthropy alongside political combat. The same DuPonts who opposed Social Security funded Delaware's black school system at a time when state resources for African American education remained desperately inadequate. The family contributed to Delaware State College. Pierre DuPont served on the state school board and as state school tax commissioner from 1925 to 1929 and again from 1944 to 1949. The DuPonts built schools. They endowed institutions. They supported causes that benefited people who would never enter Nemours or Winterthur. The contradiction was real, but not inexplicable. The DuPonts gave generously, but they gave on their own terms. They supported education as private philanthropy, not as public entitlement. They funded what they chose to fund, controlled what they chose to control, dispensed charity from positions of power, rather than submitting to democratic redistribution of wealth they considered rightfully earned. The giving was genuine. The resistance to government-mandated giving was equally genuine. Both impulses coexisted within the same family, sometimes within the same individuals. The DuPonts wanted to be seen as builders, as creators of employment and opportunity, as benefactors whose wealth flowed back to communities through schools and hospitals and cultural institutions. The public saw them as profiteers, as men who had grown rich from war and then spent fortunes trying to prevent the government from helping those who had not. Both perceptions were accurate. The estates rose, the reputation fluctuated, the family endured. Alicia was gone. The palace built for her stood complete but purposeless. Alfred DuPont, now 60 years old, faced the question of what remained. The answer arrived in the form of Jessie Ball, a woman he had known since childhood, a connection from Virginia that predated the scandals and the ostracism and the wall topped with broken glass. In 1921, 1 year after Alicia's death, Alfred married Jessie. The union was quieter than his previous marriages, less fraught with drama and family opposition. The DuPonts had already expelled Alfred from their social world. There was nothing left to lose. Jessie brought practicality and competence to a household that had known primarily grief. She would become not merely Alfred's wife, but the principal trustee of his estate, granted complete discretion over its management and disposition. Her brother Edward Ball would control the business assets. The structure Alfred created ensured that his fortune would pass through Jessie's hands, not those of the relatives who had rejected him. The gardens at Nemours continued to evolve. Between 1929 and 1932, Alfred oversaw construction of the lower gardens, extending the formal French design further from the mansion. The main vista now stretched 1/3 of a mile, a procession of symmetry and water that rivaled European precedents. The reflecting pool, with its 157 jets, remained the centerpiece, but additional features accumulated: terraces, sculpture, plantings calibrated to the Beaux-Arts vocabulary that Carrère and Hastings had established 2 decades earlier. In the mid-1930s, a memorial carillon tower rose on the grounds. The bells could sound across the property, marking time and occasion, adding an auditory dimension to the visual spectacle Alfred had created. The tower echoed similar installations at other American estates, notably Bok Tower Gardens in Florida. Alfred appreciated mechanical complexity. The carillon represented engineering as much as aesthetics, a system of bells and hammers and cables that required expertise. To design and maintain, the inventor, who held more than 200 patents, found satisfaction in such mechanisms. Alfred's health declined as the gardens grew. The precise nature of his ailments is not fully documented in surviving records, but the trajectory was clear. He had built Nemours in his 40s, lost Alicia in his late 50s, married Jessie as he approached 60. By his early 70s, the end was visible. The house was finished. The gardens were nearly complete. The wall still stood with its crown of broken glass. The question was, what would happen when Alfred was no longer there to walk the paths he had created? In 1935, Alfred I DuPont died. He was 70 years old. The estate he left behind was valued at approximately $40 million, a fortune accumulated through DuPont dividends, careful investment, and the compound growth that wealth generates when wealth is already substantial. The federal government claimed $30 million in estate taxes, a staggering sum that reflected both the size of the inheritance and the tax rates of the era. $10 million remained after the government took its share. Alfred's will contained instructions that surprised those who had known him primarily as a builder of walls. He directed that a children's hospital be constructed on the estate grounds. The man who had spent decades excluding his family would now welcome strangers, specifically sick children who needed medical care their families could not otherwise afford. The institution would bear his name. The institution would occupy his land. The Palace of Rejection would become a place of healing. The Nemours Foundation was incorporated in Florida in 1936, the year after Alfred's death. Jessie Ball DuPont oversaw the implementation of her husband's vision, working with trustees and attorneys to transform intention into brick and staff and operating procedures. In 1940, the Alfred I DuPont Institute opened as a pediatric orthopedic hospital, specializing in conditions that affected children's bones, joints, and mobility. The focus was specific, and the need was real. Children with clubfoot, scoliosis, and other orthopedic conditions found treatment at an institution funded by powder money and built on an estate designed to exclude. The hospital grew over subsequent decades. A sizable addition was completed in 1984, expanding capacity and capabilities. The institution evolved from orthopedic specialty into broader pediatric care. Today, Nemours Children's Hospital, Delaware, shares the campus with the preserved mansion and gardens. Approximately 100 acres support the medical facilities. Approximately 200 acres remain with the historic estate. The wall still stands. The hospital operates behind it. Alfred's charitable intentions did not escape dispute. In the 1970s, the Delaware Attorney General sued the trustees of Alfred's estate, alleging that they had failed to implement his charitable mission properly. The settlement reached in 1980 required that no more than 50% of trust distributions be spent outside Delaware, anchoring the fortune to the state where it had originated. In 2012, Delaware sued again, this time over renovation costs and the allocation of distributions between the Nemours Foundation and other purposes. Alfred had been dead for nearly 80 years. His money was still being fought over. The disputes reflected genuine ambiguity. Alfred had left instructions, but instructions require interpretation. Trustees exercised discretion. Attorneys general questioned that discretion. Courts adjudicated competing claims about what a dead man would have wanted. The pattern is common among large charitable bequests. The money outlasts the donor. The intentions become subject to argument. Alfred's fortune continues to fund children's medical care. Alfred's intentions remain contested. The contradiction at the heart of Nemours persists. Alfred built a wall to keep his family out. His will ensured that strangers would be welcomed in. The exclusion was personal. The generosity was institutional. Both impulses coexisted in the same man, expressed through the same property. The glass shards remain atop the wall. The children received treatment below. The contradiction was deliberate, and it endures. Ruth Wales married Henry Francis DuPont, but she did not marry Winterthur. The distinction mattered. She had accepted a husband, not a museum disguised as a residence, not 175 rooms filled with 90,000 objects requiring constant attention, not 250 employees and 99 cottages, and a Holstein herd that demanded daily management. Ruth preferred New York. Ruth preferred Southampton. Ruth called Winterthur by a private name that captured her feelings precisely. Frog Hollow. The label was not affectionate. Delaware's Brandywine Valley, for all its DuPont grandeur, was not Manhattan society. The period rooms that consumed her husband's attention held no particular interest for her. The endless acquisition of furniture and paneling and architectural salvage struck her as obsession rather than accomplishment. She tolerated Winterthur because she had married a man who could not imagine life elsewhere. She did not pretend to love it. Henry Francis, meanwhile, continued to identify his occupation on tax returns as farmer. The designation was technically accurate. The estate included working agricultural operations, and the Holstein herd won national awards with reliable consistency. But the label also reflected something deeper, a preference for understatement, a reluctance to claim the grander title that his activities warranted. He was not merely a farmer. He was the creator of the most comprehensive collection of American decorative arts ever assembled. He chose not to say so. By the late 1940s, Henry Francis approached his 70th birthday. The collection had grown for more than 2 decades. The house had expanded repeatedly to accommodate it. The staff numbered in the hundreds. The annual costs of maintenance, conservation insurance, and operations exceeded what any individual fortune could sustain indefinitely. The arithmetic was becoming clear. Winterthur, in its current form, could not continue as a private residence. The collection was too large, too important, too expensive for one family to maintain across generations. The choice presented itself starkly. He could sell, dispersing 90,000 objects to dealers and auction houses, watching the period rooms dismantled and their contents scattered. He could donate to an existing institution, surrendering control to trustees who might not share his vision. Or he could transform Winterthur itself, converting the private residence into a public museum while retaining influence over its direction and standards. Henry Francis chose transformation. The process required professional expertise he did not possess. In 1949, he hired Joseph Downs as the first director of what would become the Winterthur Museum. Downs brought credentials and connections. He had served as curator of the American Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, one of the premier positions in the field. His presence signaled seriousness of purpose. Winterthur would not be a rich man's hobby opened reluctantly to visitors. It would be a professional institution meeting professional standards. Charles Montgomery joined the staff to establish museum operations, bringing Harvard training and practical experience in antiques collection. Together, Downs and Montgomery built the administrative structure that would sustain Winterthur beyond Henry Francis's lifetime. They hired curators, registrars, conservators, and educators. They developed policies for acquisition, documentation, and display. They created the infrastructure that separates a serious museum from a house with interesting contents. In 1951, Winterthur opened to the public. Visitors could now tour the period rooms that Henry Francis had assembled over 3 decades, walking through spaces whose walls and floors had been salvaged from demolished houses across the eastern seaboard. The collection that had been one man's private obsession became a shared resource. The shy collector who had failed at Groton and disappointed his father had created something that strangers would travel to see. Henry Francis did not disappear when the museum opened. He withdrew to a residence called the Cottage, though the name understated the reality. The structure encompassed 21,345 square feet, designed by Thomas Waterman in Regency style, a substantial house by any measure except comparison to the 175-room mansion nearby. Henry Francis lived in the Cottage for the remaining 18 years of his life, close enough to monitor the museum's operations, far enough to maintain the separation between private life and public institution. The legacy programs extended Winterthur's reach beyond display. In 1952, Henry Francis launched the first graduate program in American Material Culture, a partnership with the University of Delaware that trained scholars to study the objects he had collected. The program produced curators, conservators, and academics who carried Winterthur's methods and standards to institutions across the country. The collection taught. The teaching multiplied the collection's influence. In 1957, the Hagley Museum and Library formed on the original powder mill site along the Brandywine, preserving the industrial landscape where the DuPont fortune had originated. The family's history found institutional expression at both ends. The mills where workers had died, the mansion where their labors, proceeds had accumulated. The 1960s brought unexpected recognition. When Jacqueline Kennedy undertook restoration of the White House interior, she sought advice from the acknowledged expert in American decorative arts. Henry Francis DuPont consulted on the project, applying the knowledge he had accumulated across 4 decades of collecting. He recommended Lorraine Waxman Pierce as the first White House curator, shaping the institutional structure that would maintain the executive mansion's historical character. The man whose cousins had called him milkmaid was now advising the presidency on matters of domestic arrangement. Henry Francis DuPont died in 1969. He was 89 years old. The cattle herd was sold. His daughter Ruth remained in the cottage until her own death. The museum continued. The graduate programs continued. The collection remained intact. 90,000 objects in 175 rooms, testimony to what focused attention could accomplish across a lifetime. The shy boy who had placed last in his class at Groton, who had admitted he knew he was stupid, who had disappointed his father in every way that mattered to the old soldier, had become the man who told the White House how to arrange its furniture. The museum was his vindication. The collection was his answer to everyone who had doubted him. Winterthur endured because Henry Francis had found a way to make his obsession outlast his life. The government that had purchased DuPont powder for more than a century eventually decided the company had grown too powerful. The transformation from supplier to target began in 1907 when the United States Department of Justice charged DuPont with antitrust violations. The accusation was specific. The company had colluded with competitors through the Gunpowder Trade Association to fix prices, divide markets, and eliminate competition. The practices were common among industrial combinations of the era. They were also illegal under the Sherman Act. The case proceeded through federal courts for 5 years. In 1912, the judgment arrived. DuPont was deemed a gunpowder monopoly, controlling too large a share of the American explosives market for the law to tolerate. The remedy was divestiture. The company was forced to spin off substantial portions of its operations, creating 2 new entities, Hercules Powder Company and Atlas Powder Company. The DuPont family retained the core business, but the empire had been fractured by judicial order. The antitrust action of 1912 was prologue. The larger confrontation came decades later, involving not explosives, but automobiles. DuPont had acquired a 23% stake in General Motors during the 1920s, a massive investment that linked the chemical company to the nation's dominant automaker. The relationship was mutually beneficial. DuPont supplied paints, fabrics, and other materials to General Motors factories. General Motors provided a guaranteed customer for DuPont products. The arrangement concentrated economic power in ways that attracted regulatory attention. In 1949, the United States sued DuPont over the General Motors relationship, alleging that the cross-ownership violated antitrust principles by foreclosing competition in the supply of automotive materials. The litigation consumed years. In 1957, the Supreme Court ruled that the DuPont-General Motors arrangement violated the Clayton Act. The relationship that had generated decades of profit was now illegal. The remedy took additional years to implement. In 1961, the Supreme Court ordered complete divestiture of DuPont's General Motors holdings. 63 million shares, valued at approximately $2.9 billion. The forced sale would generate enormous tax liability, potentially devastating the DuPont shareholders who would receive the distributed stock. Congress intervened, passing special legislation to minimize the tax consequences of the court-ordered divestiture. The DuPonts retained political influence even as they lost corporate control. The final General Motors stock sale occurred in 1965. The relationship that had defined American industrial concentration for 4 decades was severed. Between the antitrust actions, the company continued to profit from war. The Second World War brought production demands that dwarfed even the First. DuPont manufactured 4.5 billion pounds of explosives between 1941 and 1945, 20% more than all Allied forces had consumed during the entirety of the previous World War. The scale was almost incomprehensible, industrial capacity mobilized for destruction on a global scale. Yet the company's relationship to military production had shifted. During the First World War, military explosives had constituted 85% of DuPont output. During the Second, that figure dropped to 25%. The difference reflected transformation. DuPont now made nylon, plastics, synthetic fibers, and specialty chemicals. The consumer products that would define post-war American life flowed from DuPont laboratories and factories. The company had diversified beyond powder, reducing its dependence on the cycles of war and peace that had governed its first century. The most consequential wartime project carried no profit at all. When the United States government initiated the Manhattan Project to develop atomic weapons, it needed industrial partners capable of translating laboratory science into production-scale reality. DuPont received the assignment to design, build, and operate the Hanford Plutonium Production Facility in Washington State. The company also operated the Oak Ridge Pilot Plant in Tennessee. These installations would produce the fissile material for the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The fee DuPont charged for this work was $1. The purpose of the nominal payment was explicit: to avoid accusations of war profiteering. The Merchants of Death label still stung. The Senate hearings of the 1930s remained in memory. DuPont would contribute to the atomic bomb, but DuPont would not grow rich from the atomic bomb. The distinction mattered, even if the contribution enabled unprecedented destruction. The company that had killed with powder would now enable killing with fission, but the profit motive was formally removed. The family that had built this enterprise gradually lost control of it. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont had founded a company in 1802. His descendants had expanded it across generations, surviving explosions and antitrust actions and world wars. But wealth disperses, generations multiply. the concentrated holdings of founding families dilute into the portfolios of heirs who number in the thousands. Today, the DuPont family fortune is estimated at between $14.3 and $16 billion. The sum remains substantial, but it is spread across more than 3,500 living relatives. No single DuPont controls the company their ancestor founded. The enterprise that bore the family name merged with Dow Chemical in 2017, then split into multiple successor companies. The DuPont identity persists as brand and memory, not as family dominion. The estates remain. Namur stands behind its glass-topped wall, open to visitors and adjacent to the Children's Hospital Alfred Endowed. Winterthur operates as a museum and research institution, its 90,000 objects maintained by professional staff. The physical legacy endures. The dynastic control has dissolved into the natural entropy of wealth across generations. The DuPonts built their fortune on powder. They preserved it through chemicals. They lost control of it through the mathematics of inheritance and the passage of time. The family survives. The concentration does not. The slogan promised better things for better living through chemistry. The reality proved more complicated. The DuPont company that had pivoted from explosives to consumer products in the mid-20th century created materials that transformed daily life: nylon for stockings, Teflon for cookware, synthetic fibers for clothing and carpets. The products were useful. The products were profitable. The products also carried consequences that would take decades to reveal and longer still to address. The chemical at the center of the story is known by several names. Scientists call it perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA. Industry workers called it C8, a reference to its 8-carbon molecular chain. DuPont used it in the manufacture of Teflon beginning in 1951, the same year the company introduced the non-stick coating that would become ubiquitous in American kitchens. C8 made the manufacturing process work. C8 also resisted breakdown in ways that no one fully understood at the time. The Washington Works plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia, produced Teflon for decades. The facility sat along the Ohio River, drawing water for industrial processes and discharging waste into the surrounding environment. The communities nearby depended on the plant for employment. They also depended on water systems that drew from sources increasingly contaminated by chemicals the plant released. By 1981, DuPont scientists had detected C8 in the blood of female workers at Washington Works. The discovery prompted concern about reproductive effects. The company tracked pregnancies among exposed workers. Women were transferred to other positions. The information remained internal. The community's drinking water contaminated by plant discharges received no notification. In 1984, DuPont testing discovered C8 in the tap water of Little Hocking, Ohio, a town across the river from the plant. The contamination had migrated through groundwater and surface water into the public supply. Residents were drinking, cooking, and bathing in water containing a chemical whose health effects were not yet fully characterized but were sufficiently concerning to prompt internal corporate attention. DuPont did not disclose the finding. The residents continued drinking the water without knowledge of what it contained. The scale of contamination grew over the following decades. By 2003, estimates suggested that 2.5 million pounds of C8 had been dumped into the mid-Ohio River Valley through air emissions, water discharges, and landfill disposal. The chemical did not degrade. It accumulated in soil, in water, in the blood of people who lived downstream from the plant. 6 public water systems in West Virginia and Ohio were eventually identified as contaminated. The affected population numbered in the tens of thousands. The reckoning began with litigation in 2001. A class action lawsuit styled Leach vs. DuPont was filed on behalf of approximately 80,000 people whose water supplies had been contaminated. The case would reshape understanding of corporate liability for chemical contamination. It would also force disclosure of internal documents showing what DuPont had known and when the company had known it. The Environmental Protection Agency took separate action. In 2005, DuPont settled with the EPA for $16.5 million, at the time the largest civil penalty in the agency's history. The amount was trivial compared to DuPont's revenues and profits. It was symbolically significant as an acknowledgment that the company had violated environmental standards. The fine did not compensate affected communities. It went to the federal government. The private litigation continued for years. In 2017, DuPont and its spin-off company Chemours agreed to settle 3,550 individual lawsuits for a combined $671 million. The settlements resolved claims from people who had developed serious illnesses after exposure to contaminated water. The diseases linked to C8 exposure included kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, and pregnancy-induced hypertension. The science connecting chemical exposure to these conditions had been established through studies funded as part of the litigation settlement, research that confirmed what internal DuPont documents had suggested decades earlier. The settlements continued into the 2020s. In 2023, DuPont agreed to pay $110 million to Ohio for environmental restoration related to PFAS contamination. In 2024, a $1.18 billion settlement was approved to address PFAS contamination of public water systems across the country. The numbers climbed with each successive agreement, reflecting both the scope of contamination and the growing understanding of health consequences. The term for chemicals like C8 entered public vocabulary, forever chemicals. PFAS compounds, the broader category to which C8 belongs, do not break down in the environment. They persist in soil and water indefinitely. They accumulate in human blood, building concentration over years of exposure. The chemical properties that made them useful in manufacturing, their stability and resistance to heat and degradation, also made them permanent pollutants. What DuPont released into the Ohio River Valley would remain there in some form, essentially forever. The corporate response to mounting liability followed a familiar pattern. In 2015, DuPont spun off its Performance Chemicals division into a new company called Chemours. The separation placed much of the PFAS-related liability with the spin-off rather than the parent company. Both entities continue to face litigation. Corteva, another company created through the subsequent merger of DuPont with Dow Chemical and its subsequent breakup, also inherited portions of the legacy liability. The corporate structures that once concentrated DuPont wealth now function to distribute and manage DuPont accountability. The powder mills along the Brandywine killed 228 workers between 1802 and 1921. The names are recorded. The deaths were immediate and visible, bodies recovered from rubble, widows receiving pensions. The chemical contamination may have harmed millions, but the harm unfolds slowly, manifesting as elevated cancer rates and chronic diseases years or decades after exposure. The connection between cause and effect requires scientific study to establish. The museums at Nemours and Winterthur preserve the beauty that DuPont wealth created. They do not mention the contamination that DuPont operations caused. The period rooms and formal gardens exist in one narrative. The forever chemicals persist in another. Both are part of the same inheritance. The DuPont family produced governors and senators, philanthropists and industrialists, collectors and scientists. It also produced John Eleuthère DuPont, who would become the only member of the dynasty convicted of murder. John was born in 1938, heir to a fortune he had done nothing to create. His branch of the family owned Foxcatcher Farm, an estate in suburban Philadelphia that had once been devoted to horse breeding and dairy cattle. John grew up wealthy and isolated, a combination that would prove significant. He developed interests that wealth could indulge: ornithology, philately, the collection and study of birds and stamps. He founded the Delaware Museum of Natural History, a legitimate scientific institution that houses research collections used by scholars. The museum represented genuine contribution, funded by DuPont money and shaped by DuPont. Attention. But John DuPont's attention shifted. In the 1980s, he became fascinated with amateur wrestling, a sport with deep American traditions and Olympic prestige, but limited commercial appeal. Wrestling attracted John for reasons that remained somewhat opaque. Perhaps the discipline appealed to him. Perhaps the physicality offered something his cerebral pursuits lacked. Perhaps he simply found a community willing to accept his involvement in exchange for his resources. Foxcatcher Farm transformed. John built training facilities on the property, world-class accommodations where wrestlers could live, train, and prepare for competition. He recruited athletes, including Olympic-caliber performers, who relocated to the estate for access to coaching and equipment. The arrangement benefited the wrestlers materially. It also placed them in proximity to a man whose mental state was deteriorating in ways they could not fully assess. Dave Schultz came to Foxcatcher as one of the premier wrestlers in American history. He had won Olympic gold in 1984, competed at the highest international levels, and transitioned into coaching. He was respected throughout the wrestling community for his skill, his generosity, and his willingness to mentor younger athletes. He lived on the Foxcatcher property with his wife Nancy and their children, occupying a house that John DuPont provided as part of the arrangement. The relationship between John and Dave was complex. John considered himself a coach and mentor, though his actual wrestling knowledge was limited. Dave navigated the situation with patience, accepting the eccentricities of a wealthy patron in exchange for the opportunity to continue working in the sport he loved. Other wrestlers on the property observed John's behavior growing increasingly erratic, paranoid statements, grandiose claims, episodes that suggested something beyond mere eccentricity. On January 26, 1996, John DuPont drove to the house where Dave Schultz lived on the Foxcatcher property. Dave was in the driveway working on a car. John stopped, lowered his window, and shot Dave Schultz dead. Nancy Schultz witnessed the murder. There was no warning, no apparent provocation, no explanation that made sense to anyone who observed the killing. Police surrounded the Foxcatcher mansion. John retreated inside, and a standoff ensued that lasted 2 days. Negotiators eventually persuaded him to surrender after cutting off the building's heat forced him outside. He was arrested and charged with murder. The trial revealed the extent of John DuPont's mental deterioration. He had experienced paranoid delusions for years. He believed he saw Disney characters wandering the property, that trees were marching toward the mansion, that geese on the grounds were using dark magic against him. He claimed at various times to be the Dalai Lama and the Christ child. Psychiatrists testified about his condition. The jury concluded that John was mentally ill, but not legally insane, a distinction that meant he understood his actions were wrong, even if mental illness had contributed to them. In 1997, John DuPont was convicted of third-degree murder. The sentence ranged from 13 to 30 years in prison. He would serve that sentence at a state correctional institution, a DuPont in a cell, rather than a mansion, his fortune irrelevant to his daily circumstances. John DuPont died in prison on December 9, 2010, at the age of 72. His burial reflected the strangeness of his final years. He was interred at DuPont de Nemours Cemetery, the family burial ground, wearing a wrestling singlet. The athletic garment that symbolized his final obsession accompanied him into the grave alongside ancestors who had built powder mills and chemical empires. Foxcatcher Farm was sold. 123 acres of the property now serve as the campus of Episcopal Academy, a private school where students walk grounds once patrolled by a murderer. The training facilities are gone. The wrestling program John funded with such intensity has dispersed. Dave Schultz's memory is honored in wrestling communities that still mourn his loss. The DuPonts produced governors, senators, philanthropists, museum founders, and one convicted murderer. The family name carries all of them. The estate at Nemours preserves Alfred's wounded pride. The museum at Winterthur preserves Henry Francis's obsessive collecting. The prison records preserve John's crime. The legacy includes everything. The estates that DuPont money built now belong to the public, or at least to the portion of the public willing to pay admission. The transformation from private refuge to tourist destination took decades to accomplish. The maintenance of that transformation requires constant effort and perpetual funding. Nemours opens its doors Tuesday through Sunday, April through December. The schedule reflects practical calculation, winter heating costs, seasonal staffing, the patterns of American tourism. The Nemours Foundation, a nonprofit organization, owns and operates the property. The foundation traces its authority to Alfred the Père DuPont's will, the document that directed construction of the Children's Hospital and established the charitable mission that his fortune would serve. The estate is listed on the National Register of Historic Places as the Nemours Historic District, a designation that acknowledges architectural and historical significance without providing operating funds. Recognition brings prestige. Recognition does not pay for roof repairs or garden maintenance or the specialized conservators required to preserve 110,000 objects accumulated across a century. Between 2005 and 2008, Nemours underwent a comprehensive renovation. The cost reached $39 million by some accounts, $72 million by others. The discrepancy reflects different methods of calculation: direct construction expenses versus total project costs, including planning, conservation, and lost revenue during closure. Before any work could begin, staff spent 4 months emptying the house. Every object, all 110,000 items, had to be cataloged, packed, and stored. Only then could contractors address electrical systems, structural concerns, and the accumulated deterioration that large buildings accumulate over decades of use. The renovation restored what time had degraded. The reopening in 2008 returned Nemours to public access, its rooms arranged to approximate Alfred's era, its gardens maintained in the French formal style he had specified. Current admission is $20 per adult, a price point that balances accessibility against operational necessity. The wall remains. The broken glass shards still crown its length, 3,200 running feet of jagged edges pointing upward. The barrier that Alfred built to wound his relatives now serves as historical artifact, preserved alongside the chandeliers and the clocks that belonged to Marie Antoinette. 5 miles away, Winterthur operates on a larger scale. The museum, garden, and research library function as an integrated institution, each component supporting the others. Annual visitors exceed 100,000, a figure that places Winterthur among the more successful historic house museums in the country. The number also represents challenge. 100,000 visitors means 100,000 opportunities for wear, for accident, for the gradual degradation that human presence inflicts on fragile environments. The collection requires constant care. 90,000 objects demand climate control, maintaining temperature and humidity within ranges that prevent deterioration. Conservation staff address damage as it occurs and conduct preventive treatments before damage becomes visible. Insurance protects against catastrophic loss while adding substantial annual expense. The bills accumulate: utilities, salaries, materials, equipment, the endless maintenance that historic structures demand. A house built to display wealth now consumes wealth to survive. The library remains free and open to the public by appointment, honoring Henry Francis DuPont's commitment to scholarship. Graduate programs continue in partnership with the University of Delaware, training new generations of curators and conservators. In 2019, the television program Antiques Roadshow filmed at Winterthur, bringing the estate to millions of viewers who might never visit in person. The exposure helps. The exposure does not solve underlying financial pressures. The estate's footprint has contracted over generations. Henry Francis inherited more than 2,600 acres. Winterthur today encompasses approximately 1,000 acres. The remainder sold or transferred to reduce, carrying costs and generate capital for operations. The collection remains intact. The land has shrunk around it. The museum sector as a whole faces difficulties that Nemours and Winterthur share. 50% of American museums have not recovered to pre-pandemic attendance levels. Historic house museums, a category that includes both DuPont estates, struggle more than most. The audience for period rooms and formal gardens skews older. Younger visitors prefer interactive experiences, digital engagement, entertainment rather than contemplation. The institutions built to preserve the past must adapt to attract the future. Climate control runs day and night. Conservators examine objects for signs of damage. Gardeners maintain landscapes designed for aristocratic leisure. The estates that DuPonts designed to exclude now welcome strangers for the price of admission. The transformation is complete and also never quite finished. The work continues because the alternative is loss. 228 workers died in the powder mills along the Brandywine. Their deaths funded the gardens, the period rooms, the reflecting pool with its 157 jets. The family that built these estates also funded opposition to Social Security, also concealed chemical contamination for decades, also produced a man who shot an Olympic athlete in his own driveway. And yet, the Children's Hospital treats patients today. The museum teaches graduate students how to preserve American material culture. The gardens bloom each spring, the houses stand. The DuPont were not villains, they were not heroes. They were a family that made gunpowder when the country needed gunpowder, made chemicals when the country wanted chemicals, and built houses when they needed somewhere to hide from each other. Nemours still has its wall, 3,200 feet of stone, topped with broken glass. Winterthur still has its period rooms, 175 spaces filled with salvage from other people's demolished homes. The Brandywine still runs past the ruins of the original mills, where workers once died so that a shy man could buy a Pennsylvania chest and call it a life's work. What do we preserve when we preserve a house? The beauty, the cost, or only what we choose to remember? If you enjoy deep investigations into America's great estates and the dynasties who built them, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Tell me in the comments which family we should explore next. Every fortune has its shadow. Every mansion has its price. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next investigation.